So this week, we read the short essay by Bertrand Russell in Praise of Idleness. What did you think about it?
Well, it was nice to read thoughts articulated that I'm sure most civilized human beings can actually agree with if they can overcome brainwashing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, hearing the title, In Praise of Idleness, and the author, I think that most people would be put off by it. It's kind of the idea that you never know what a thing is. Bertrand was a mathematician and philosopher. It just sounds kind of like we should all be wasting our days in daydreams and philosophy that doesn't really have to do with life. And I guess the fact that it was written in 1932 wouldn't help, but I think that the essay has a whole lot to do with our world today. He talks about automation and the ruling elites, propaganda, the meaning of work. It's a really short and thoughtful and thought-provoking and actually funny essay.
It is funny. It is very thought-provoking. And it really exposes the hypocrisy of the leisure class.
Right.
It's the leisure class that promotes the idea of the virtue of work for those not in the leisure class.
Right.
And it's funny what you're saying about philosophy, because on some level, philosophy is actually something associated with the leisure class.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And he talks about workers versus managers versus advisors versus politicians. The workers have to do the most, and then the advisors just tell the managers what to tell the workers to do, and the politicians tell the advisors. And the further you go up that, the less you have to do, and
the more you get paid.
Yeah, the more you get paid, right. And then he introduces another class onto that, which is landowners.
Right.
And they make their money basically by being just lazy and doing nothing and getting money from the people that are not lazy and that are working.
Right. And all the while warning that if the working class had more leisure time, it would destroy them somehow psychologically, because they just wouldn't know what to do with the free time anyway.
Yeah, that argument is one that I've actually heard out of a lot of people's mouths, and it always surprises me.
Well, it's funny, but I made the point about brainwashing. I often hear sentiments expressed by people that could not arise organically among the demographic from which they hail. That's brainwashing.
Right.
This is interesting. I'd like to read this excerpt from early on just to give us a concept of how he divides it up.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, what is work? Work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relatively to other such matter. Second, telling other people to do so. The first kind is unpleasant and ill-paid. The second is pleasant and highly paid. The second is capable of indefinite extension. There are not only those who give orders, but those who give advice as to what orders should be given. Usually, two opposite kinds of advice are given simultaneously by two different bodies of men. This is called politics. The skill for this kind of work is not knowledge of the subjects as to which advice is given, but knowledge of the art of persuasive speaking and writing, i.e. of advertising.
Yeah, that's really good. And a lot of times people get turned off by this idea that you're jealous of the 1% or whatever. The essay, it's not about the unfairness of the idle and leisurely rich, but of all of the other people who are overworked.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he makes a great point where you have an innovation and now a system is twice as efficient, and it would make sense for everyone to go from working 8 hours to 4 hours. But no, they just fire half the people. And now you have people who are overworked and other people who are unemployed.
Right. Yeah, well, one thing I thought that was kind of interesting, he talks about how we have this abundance, and that seems to continue even if people stop working. And he gives this kind of proof that in World War I, a huge percentage of Americans stopped their jobs to produce for the war, but the abundance just continued on.
Yeah, I found that section really powerful, especially in the context of the view that this is sometimes framed in the context of, yes, but they were just borrowing the money. It was just all based on borrowing, and of course that all needs to be paid back.
Right.
But he makes a really important point where he said, that, of course, would have been impossible. A man cannot eat a loaf of bread that does not yet exist. The war showed conclusively that by the scientific organization of production, it is possible to keep modern populations in fair comfort on a small part of the working capacity of the modern world. If at the end of the war, the scientific organization which had been created in order to liberate men for fighting and munition work had been preserved, and the hours of work had been cut down to 4, all would have been well. Instead of that, the old chaos was restored. Those whose work was demanded were made to work long hours, and the rest were left to starve as unemployed. Why? Because work is a duty. He calls this the morality of the slave state.
Yeah, he talks very well about how duty is a propaganda tool of the elites to inculcate a sense in us that we should work, that we should be responsible to giving to the elites.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Right.
If you were in my position, you would go mad. But for you, there's just nothing as rewarding as working yourself to death.
Exactly.
He made interesting points about also this section. I'd like to read a brief excerpt.
Sure.
We have no attempt at economic justice, so that a large proportion of the total produce goes to a small minority of the population, many of whom do not work at all. Owing to the absence of any central control over production, we produce hosts of things that are not wanted. We keep a large percentage of the working population idle because we can dispense with their labor by making others overwork. When all these methods prove inadequate, we have a war. We cause a number of people to manufacture high explosives and a number of others to explode them, as if we were children who had just discovered fireworks. By combination of all these devices, we manage through, though with difficulty, to keep alive the notion that a great deal of manual work must be the lot of the average man.
Yeah.
I mean, just even this train of thought, if enough people could really follow this train of thought and move forward, it could just radically transform life on this planet.
Absolutely. So just to go back a little bit and frame some of his ideas historically, he talks about first, when we were subsistence farmers and that sort of thing, work was actually virtuous because we were creating food for our family, we were supporting our family, and so on. And then, of course, the priests and higher-ups, other higher-ups in the city or village or whatever, would take a portion of that, a tax.
Right.
And then they would be able to take that from basically everyone in the city or country and store it. And then when a famine would hit, all of the workers, subsistence farmers, etc., would die. And the priest class could just live off the stores that they had just stolen from everyone. And after that, they took that idea of work being virtuous in the sense of supporting your family and made it a part of taking money. To quote from Russell, in England in the early 19th century, 15 hours was the ordinary day's work for a man. Children sometimes did as much, and very commonly did 12 hours a day. When meddlesome busybodies suggested that perhaps these hours were rather long, they were told that work kept adults from drink and children from mischief. When I was a child, shortly after working man had acquired the vote, certain public holidays were established by law to the great indignation of the upper classes. I remember hearing an old duchess say, "What do the poor want with holidays? They ought to work." People nowadays are less frank, but the sentiment persists and is a source of much economic confusion.
Humanity truly is enslaved by a mentality.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize how the advocacy for work and the glorification of labor is coming from people who don't actually work.
Right.
And another thing is that in our economic system now in the West, there's a belief among many people that billionaires are almost like demigods.
Yeah.
They took the world, they shaped it according to their will.
Right.
The truth is, there is something to being a visionary, to being an entrepreneur, but it's also a lot of people who are obscenely rich are people who know how to actually get money out of the government.
Yeah.
But there's this aura around people, and there's this belief that there is an elite and that they should live the life that we would envision for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that we should watch them and celebrate them. And they're called celebrities.
Right. I've noticed recently there have been a lot of these sorts of documentary devotionals and that sort of thing to billionaires. You had that really popular Zuckerberg film, and you have, of course, Elon Musk. There are a lot of these figures. Even when I watched, I think it was called The Martian, I felt it was just like one more step in that direction where you have this tale of a do-no-wrong visionary who is capable of everything. There's just some kind of strange worship like you talked about. And that I think it has accelerated in the millennial generation that seems to be in ways to be repeating the materialism of the 1980s. But rather than grabbing the money, they're devoted to others who have grabbed the money.
Well, isn't Steve Jobs one of those people?
Oh, sure.
He even has a spiritual aura around him.
Yeah.
Even with those suicide nets in China, the people at the Apple factories, like jumping to their deaths.
Let me share another quote that fits well with that.
Okay.
Suppose that at a given moment, a certain number of people are engaged in the manufacture of pins. They make as many pins as the world needs, working, say, 8 hours a day. Someone makes an invention by which the same number of men can make twice as many pins as before, but the world does not need twice as many pins. Pins are already so cheap that hardly any more will be bought at a lower price. In a sensible world, everybody concerned in the manufacture of pins would take to working 4 hours instead of 8, and everything else would go on as before. But in the actual world, this would be thought demoralizing. The men still work 8 hours. There are too many pins. Some employers go bankrupt, and half the men previously concerned in making pins are thrown out of work. There is, in the end, just as much leisure as on the other plan, but half the men are totally idle, while half are still overworked. In this way, it is ensured that the unavoidable leisure shall cause misery all around, instead of being a universal source of happiness. Can anything more insane be imagined?
It is insane. Absolutely a correct framing for it. So much that gets done doesn't even need to get done anyway.
Right.
I mean, this is a giant garbage generating planetary work machine driving against the viability of the ecosystem as a life support system for human beings on this planet.
Exactly.
And people feel guilty if they step off of it for 5 seconds.
Yeah, they do.
You know, Robert Anton Wilson has talked about this. If we actually went with what was necessary for production to meet needs,
yeah,
and freed people up, we would have a renaissance like we can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. If you go back to Italy, you go back to Florence, the cities in that region, there were brilliant people. No one's saying that those people were not brilliant. But there are brilliant people now. There's brilliant people in every generation.
Yeah.
That so much of what happened with the Renaissance was a function of the power of a banking family.
Right.
And you have different systems that can support the arts. If you just left people alone, they would produce art. Now, some of it might not be so good. Some of it might be amazing. But the thing is to let people do it. People will do it. I know plenty of people who would love to sit down and read John Milton or Dante. They would love to actually read truly great works of literature. They would love to spend more time not just going to museums and looking at art, but creating art. And this idea that we should be alienated and that we should look again upon certain figures like they were demigods and that we're these weird alienated peons. It's a completely dysfunctional mindset. And the whole idea of the crabs in the bucket.
Yeah.
That's fostered by the system because people are resentful because they don't feel like they were able to pursue their interests. And I'm not saying that people don't squander leisure time when they're given it, but everybody has to be given that decision.
Yeah. When you talked about the Italian banking family, Russell made the good point that there isn't some higher prevalence of genius or vision among them. Genius and vision are basically equally distributed among all of the classes. And because such families had leisure, they were able to create civilization. He talked about the connection of philosophy.
Right.
And what you and I and Russell are all talking about is if a small group of people with leisure create philosophy and civilization itself and so on, what could we all do if we all had leisure?
That's what Robert Anton Wilson was going on about. And he was absolutely right. Once you see this, once your eyes are open to this, they remain open unless you numb yourself and you just feel so much pressure from the world that you try to contort your body back into a shape that it can fit back in the cubbyhole. There's this excerpt here where he's talking about the leisure class. The class as a whole was not exceptionally intelligent. It might produce one Darwin, but against him had to be set tens of thousands of country gentlemen who never thought of anything more intelligent than fox hunting. He says, in a world where no one is compelled to work more than 4 hours a day, every person possessed of scientific curiosity will be able to indulge it, and every painter will be able to paint without starving.
Yeah.
However excellent his pictures may be, young writers will not be obliged to draw attention to themselves by sensational pot boilers with a view to acquiring the economic independence needed for monumental works, for which, when the time at last comes, they will have lost the taste and the capacity. And that's absolutely true as far as when people make art, they make art to sell it.
Right. Yeah, this definitely has some overlap with the section in The Delicate War on doing things for their own sake, and how basically the modern world focuses on doing things for the sake of something else. One of the grand templates of that is to do everything for profit.
Right, and then how much of that is storing up a bunch of profit until you keel over and someone else just takes it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, he makes a good point. The people who hoard are not really helping the economy.
Yeah.
You really need to have the money. If you're going to use currency, then the currency should be flowing.
Yeah. I thought that was one of the greater points in the essay. There's this sort of yin-yang to receiving income and spending it. When you engage in leisure activities, you pay money out, and that money is then someone else's to use for their leisure. But when you only save, it isn't part of that beautiful set of transactions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's almost like the image of the dragon who guards the gold and guards the virgin, which he cannot use.
Yeah. And related to that idea of doing things for their own sake, he makes a distinction between passive and active forms of doing things for their own sake. And he says that a lot of people will consider passive leisure activities to just be frivolous. But then he made that really cool point that, for example, if you go to watch a movie, going and spending your money to watch the movie supports the livelihoods of everyone that made the movie.
Right. And those people, when they're making the movie, that's considered great. Oh, they're making a movie. They're doing something. They're being productive. But if you go and watch it, then that's frivolous. Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. So I'd like to talk about one of the main ideas in the essay is that he's campaigning for the 4-hour work day and or 4-day work week. And I have a number of ideas that I'd like to share about that. Back when I was first trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life, one really appealing option that came to me was a semi-asceticism just me in a tiny house or small apartment surrounded by a lot of books and films. And I wouldn't use that much electricity or water. I would eat cheaply, and I'd find maybe a 3-day-a-week job to support it. But of course, what I soon found out is that those jobs don't exist. They want your whole week. They want you in the office 5 days a week or more. And, that's 70% or more of the days in the week. They want you in there in the best time of day when the sun is shining, when you could be strolling in a park or reading. And then they try to get way more out of you than that. It reminds me of William Burroughs' algebra of need about dope dealers. And there are 3 rules to the algebra. I think they were get as much as you can for it, make them wait as much as possible, and take back as much as you can. And that basically seems like the business world to me. So I think it's extremely hard to find that kind of job where you would only work, say, 3 days a week and be able to support yourself, have your leisure, and so on. And you really have to ask why. On top of that, the system overall really encourages families and childbirth and so on. So you only get the best deal on toilet paper if you buy 48 rolls at a time, or the value pack of food that will spoil before you could eat half of it alone. And then you have to pay school taxes for children that you will never have, and so on.
Well, yeah, that's another thing. I feel like a lot of people will actually be working ultimately to support a system that is nurturing someone else's children.
Right. One of the crazy things is that they want all of your good time, as much as they can get of it. But most of the people at work aren't doing any work. They're simply trapped there, and it's a prison, and everyone knows this. Every worker has lived it. Last week, I read in Business Insider, there was research in there that shows that the average person in an 8-hour shift actually only works 2 hours and 53 minutes. So, the other 5+ hours is just imprisonment. And for what? I, of course, have personally experienced that. I remember back in the pre-internet days, I was just playing solitaire on a Windows PC for hours and hours and hours every day. There was nothing else to do. And the whole thing is just anti-productive. You get worn out. You could have been having fun those 5 hours after all your work is done, and you'd be almost excited to go back and finish, your 3 hours the next day, but instead you're just stuck there for hours and hours for no reason at all. Those hours mean that you get worn out, and then you become a less productive worker, a less happy worker. It makes no sense. So the Business Insider research said 2 hours and 53 minutes a day. That's how much a person works. More conservatively, Harvard did a study that found that a 6-hour workday would be better. But even better than that, Microsoft Japan tested out a 4-day work week for a year, I think, just this and last year. And they found that productivity jumped up 40%.
It jumped up 40% from an 8-hour workday?
From a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week.
Oh, 4-day work week. Okay.
So you cut 20% of the work time off, and you gain 40% in productivity.
Well, think of how much more refreshed people are also from the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And a 3-day weekend, it looks pretty good. I would prefer 4, but maybe another company will try that out. We're seeing a real world example there, though, with that cutting people's hours gives you more productivity, and you're going to get happier workers.
There have been multiple points where I've felt like saying, hey, man, you're preaching to the choir, but I realize this isn't just a conversation between us, but it's really important that people have that feeling. Like, of course, what is the point?
Right. There really isn't one. I mean, you could get conspiratorial about it. There are all sorts of ways. When you think back to the Duchess that Russell mentioned, asking what the poor would want with a vacation.
Yeah.
So doing the math on that, taking the 2 hours and 53 minutes a day of work as the base, that means that the average person works less than 15 hours, does less than 15 hours of work a week, which is easily doable in 3 days.
Right.
And they would not be full-time days. You could do 3 part-time days of work a week and get all of the work done.
But again, going back, what they really want is then to say, okay, well, then we'll fire this many people and just have you work this many more hours. But of course, losing the whole idea of where the increased productivity actually comes from.
Right. It seems to be the case that for many, many workers, perhaps most, 3 half days of work would do it. all the pins would get made, all the documents would get typed up. And then they'd actually have a life and time for their family and kids and time for creating art, for leisure, even for working on their own projects that could better the world. But of course, instead, we get that situation you described where you're just going to lay off a bunch of people and then overwork the rest. It's complete insanity.
And watch movies depicting the lives of people who are free. Or watch movies about people who are in some sort of system of imprisonment and how they break free of that. And then your next feeling of liberation is to watch the sequel.
Yeah.
You know, and it's funny too when we talk about all these traditions of mindfulness, where they talk about being in the now.
Mm-hmm.
The whole drive of the system is away from now.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. When you do something for the sake of something else, that element is already there. You're not working with what you have. You're somewhere else.
And you're almost invariably sleep deprived. Because then you take the time that you missed and you try to do things when you get home.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it cuts into your sleep time.
Right.
And that disrupts your dream life.
It does.
And that puts you out of touch with deeper levels of your psyche.
Right.
And life gets thrown further and further out of balance.
It's a theft of our time. And then on top of it, they basically try to steal our money as well. On television here in Japan last year, I saw this sort of advertorial on a news program. I guess it was supported by Big Towel or whatever, but they said that you should change all of your hand towels and bath towels every 6 months. Is that something people do?
No, I wasn't aware of this.
You find those sorts of advertorials or whatever you want to call them about all sorts of things. I think that basically if you followed all of the rules that are out there, you would just have absolutely no money and no time, no savings. You wouldn't be able to scrape by. I mean, many, many people are barely able to scrape by as it is. And it's just the overall situation where we are lied to and our time is stolen, and then they try to steal the money as well.
They do. And the thing is, as far as creating leisure for the leisure class, they have all that they need. They don't need to steal any more from us. They just steal it and lock it away somewhere in a vault.
Yeah.
Which goes back to the image of the dragon.
Right.
It's actually a very small percentage of the population. It isn't 1%.
No, it isn't.
I've worked as a tutor for people in the 1%. They're working hard.
Yeah.
A lot of them are on a crazy schedule, especially the people who are they've just scraped into the 1% because they know the way that the system is set up. It's very easy to no longer be in the 1%.
Right.
When you're in the 1%, you have types of differential advantage. You have a certain amount of leverage. But if you slip, you can lose that leverage very quickly. And so their situation, I think, is very different. And a lot of them actually did have to work to get there. So what it is that sacrifices are made over a generation or 2 generations.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone's actually born into the 1%.
Yeah.
But then it isn't long before there's a lack of a sense of how they got to the family got to the 1%, and then they're not in the 1% anymore. That's why I respect the people who've hired me as a tutor, because they know that if the kid's mind gets soft, they're not going to stay there. Whereas people who are in a much higher echelon can be much more decadent.
Yeah.
They're more likely to have an intellectual class serve them.
Right.
And then sometimes they discover that intellectual class is actually taking over, and they get drowned by one of the servants while they were taking a bath. But the point being, the whole dynamic that people are fighting over, we could actually all live like that anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the point? I mean, the real riches are those riches that are within us.
Right.
Terence McKenna was right to a certain degree when he said the art in the museums is amazing, but also fall back into yourself or experiment with psychedelic plants and you'll discover those riches within you.
Yeah. Russell talks about that because of modern technology, we should be able to all have great leisure. I see the point of it, and I think he's right. At one point, he asks, what will happen when the point has been reached where everybody could be comfortable without working long hours? And I think that we're there, actually. One thing that it reminded me of is the present automation that is going on and where it's heading in the future. So I thought I would just say a word about that.
Yeah.
China is really at the forefront. I guess maybe that could be surprising to some people, but just to give an example, I'm going to exaggerate on this a little bit, but there are a few companies. I'll focus on one company. They have a machine that spits out video game cartridges. So if you want a reproduction of an old video game cartridge that is super expensive now because of rich collectors or whatever, you can get a cheap reproduction from this Chinese company. So you place an order online for the game that you want, and the computer online probably talks to another computer that keeps track of the orders, and they can't justify turning on the cartridge making machine just for one order. So the computer just keeps track, and once, say, it reaches 10 orders, the computer fires up the machine. The machine prints the cartridge labels and makes the cartridges into games, which are dropped off a conveyor into a shipping bag. Of course, the computer has labeled the shipping bags with the right addresses. When a shipping bag gets a cartridge, it seals and falls into a bin. When the bin is full, the computer text messages the post office to come and ship it, and text messages the owner about how much money he just got. He glances at his smartphone over dinner somewhere. And then the Chinese government subsidizes exports by offering heavily reduced overseas shipping to companies. So they have this heavy automation and heavy aid by the government going on, and no one is working, and everyone is getting the video games that they want. And also just this week, Uniqlo, the big Japanese fashion chain, announced that their flagship warehouse here in Tokyo has become 90% automated, including a robot that folds packages and boxes t-shirts. So we're really there and heading more and more in the direction of just total automation, where basically you just keep the goop supplied to the factory and the robots will keep building the things that we want and need. And what happens then?
And one thing that I think might arise in people's minds is, well, what about when it breaks down?
Yeah.
And my thoughts are that there are enough highly intelligent nerds who are interested enough in any endeavor that there will be people who can do all the maintenance.
Sure.
You'll always find those people.
Yeah, you will.
And Peter Joseph has noted this too. If you have a society that's actually set up to meet people's needs, people feel more of a desire to actually contribute. Say, oh, well, we've got a problem. We have to solve it.
Yeah.
You know, even when you see charities collecting and sometimes you see someone, well, I'm not going to give them $1. Mm-hmm. It's not because people are necessarily just greedy. It's because they believe that money is just going to go to pay people who work for the charity and that the Charity Act doesn't actually do anything other than collect money and advertise itself.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of charities that work like that. I wish I could remember the figure, but there's an extremely high percentage of donations that are used just to propagate the charity, including to pay its directors their salaries or non-salaries, whatever they're called.
Right. Where the biggest profits are a non-profit. Didn't Graham Hancock write a book about that? The Lords of Poverty or something?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons people don't want to actually contribute anything to charities because they know that they're scams.
Yeah.
But if you have a society that's actually set up like that, there are enough highly intelligent people. I don't think you would have a shortage in that respect. I really don't.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I don't see it in any way, actually. Well, you get that question. I think it's really just moot. And then, of course, you get the question of what's going to happen when robots take people's jobs. And in this insane world that we've been describing, well, a bunch of people are going to be laid off and they're not going to have money and they're going to have all kinds of problems. But that need not be the way that it is. And I think that's really what this essay is about and what we're talking about.
If you look at so much of the conflict that exists too, where you have advanced nations and then you have improved working conditions and it becomes more and more of a consumer society, and then businesses say, hey, I could get much cheaper labor here, so then things get outsourced. And before people know what happens, they're citizens of a falling empire and they're scrounging for crumbs and all the food is crap.
Yeah.
But so much of that is based upon exploiting somebody else. But if you had a global movement that said, no, we've got to liberate everybody. Take a conflict, take the refugee issue in Europe. So many of those people are not actually refugees. We'll take the people who are refugees. That's exactly what Bertrand Russell is talking about. War is an industry. There were a number of countries that wanted to liberate themselves from that industry, but what they discovered is their economy was much more dependent on weapons manufacturing than anyone wanted to admit. Sweden is a massive weapons manufacturer.
Yeah.
A lot of these countries, they depend on this war machine. And then to take the other group of people where there's an issue there's all kinds of conflicts in Europe. Well, they're not really refugees, they're migrants. That's true. Why are they leaving their countries? It's this whole predatory system with the structural adjustment programs, the kids working in the mines, working the kids to death in the mines.
Yeah.
And as long as that type of system exists, none of us are safe.
Right.
There's a line in a Pretender song where it says, when you own a big chunk of the bloody third world, your babies discover the scenery. But it's more than that. It owns you.
Right.
So that system with this subjugation and exploitation of the third world, you wake up one day and realize you're a peon in your so-called advanced society.
Yeah.
But the whole system is incoherent. Even the people who are storing up all the riches, it's not just a matter that they're headed towards the grave anyway. The viability of the ecosystem is going into oblivion. If we're really banking on that seed bank in Svalbard where they have all those all those seeds, take those conflicts. It is that economic system. People who say that the third world has been ripped off, people who are on the Noam Chomsky train of thought, Zeitgeist movement train of thought, Peter Joseph train of thought, when they say that the third world has been ripped off, they're actually correct.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about really is moving towards a type 1 civilization.
Mm.
And I know that people have a lot of anxiety about this because they're concerned with national sovereignty. They're obsessed with the UN, Agenda 21. They want to kill us all. You know, like all these ideas are out there. The globalists. We've got to make some moves.
Yeah.
And make this work, or this is going to get very dark. And it already is dark.
Yeah.
People just don't see it.
Right.
And that's part of why I think you're agreeing with me. None of us are safe.
Right.
Even when people don't see all the animals getting tortured or the agribusiness. Well, I'm not an animal. Yeah, but now you're dying of a heart attack. Or now like you've got mad cow disease or all these other things that are going on. And the plastic that permeates the ocean and the snows in the highest mountains. And the bellies of birds everywhere. And part of it is actually needless production. And that's one of the things that he talked about is a lot of stuff that we're producing, we really don't need.
Yeah.
It's like you're working in a plant that's generating something that has a very short lifespan of some ceremonial meaning to somebody as it passes through their hands in an instant on the way to the landfill.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've pretty much covered it.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you want to end with Russell's vision of that future where people have leisure?
Yeah, you can read it, and then we'll just end it there.
Well, if you want to read it, you can. Either way is fine.
I feel like I've read more excerpts than you have.
Okay. So the last paragraph in Russell's essay is basically a kind of vision of where we are and where we could be. And I think maybe it would be cool to end the podcast with that. Above all, there will be happiness and joy of life instead of frayed nerves, weariness, and dyspepsia. The work exacted will be enough to make leisure delightful, but not enough to produce exhaustion. Since men will not be tired in their spare time, they will not demand only such amusements as are passive and vapid. At least 1% will probably devote the time not spent in professional work to pursuits of some public importance, and since they will not depend upon these pursuits for their livelihood, their originality will be unhampered, and there will be no need to conform to the standards set by elderly pundits. But it is not only in these exceptional cases that the advantages of leisure will appear. Ordinary men and women, having the opportunity of a happy life, will become more kindly and less persecuting. And less inclined to view others with suspicion. The taste for war will die out, partly for this reason, and partly because it will involve long and severe work for all. Good nature is, of all moral qualities, the one that the world needs most, and good nature is the result of ease and security, not of a life of arduous struggle. Modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all. We have chosen instead to have overwork for some and starvation for others. Hitherto we have continued to be as energetic as we were before there were machines. In this we have been foolish. But there is no reason to go on being foolish forever.
Amen.
So do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.